Hey, everybody. So we're just slowly admitting folks, and we had a little bit of technical issues, so thank you everyone for your patience. We're actually getting folks from one Zoom link to the other, so kind of migrating everyone over that way. Let's see, make sure I got everybody who's here. Awesome. All right, well, mekuhug. Welcome everyone. Mekurimechinkihoy, welcome here. My name is Dominique Day Hunter. Can everyone hear me okay? Awesome, awesome. It's so good to be here with you all today. Again, my name is Dominique Day Hunter, and I'm the program manager for Indigenous East. And we also have Alexa Sutton Lawrence, who will be joining us just in a minute. She's working out our Zoom link details right now. So yeah, she is going to be joining us in a moment. Um, Alrighty. So, first off, okay, perfect. All right, so first off, I just wanted to say thank you all so much for joining us. We're really excited as this is like our first convening via virtual of Indigenous East and a little bit about us. We are a growing network of both people and Indigenous people and leaders and spaces in land rematriation all up and down the Eastern United States from originally our territory that we were looking for to kind of like help was Maine to Florida. But we actually have some Indigenous leaders here from New Brunswick, Canada, from Passamaquoddy tribe, as well as some folks who will be joining us from Puerto Rico as well. So we're very excited to see, in addition to our panel here, who we'll introduce momentarily, we actually have 11 other land rematriation leaders who will be joining us, and a total of 25 Indigenous folks who are actively participating in land rematriation, whether that be as leaders or as participants in community. So admitting a few more folks here. Let's see, and I think it'd be great to have introduce our panel. We're actually going to have a couple panel presentations. So pull that up. All right, perfect. So a little bit more background about Indigenous East. We started with kind of collection of projects that Alexa was a part of through her work with the Ocean Conservancy and the Wilderness Society and various organizations. And this vision kind of came to pass of wanting to directly help land rematriation projects, specifically in the East, as we're first contact folks, first contact peoples, and the unique challenges that we face, which we're going to talk about a little bit today. But I would like to introduce our, let's see, panelists, intros. Okay, I can find y'all's intros right off the bat. Would y'all like to introduce yourself? Would that be okay? So we have Dr. Crystal Cavalier from Seven Directions of Service. We have Vice Chief Cheryl Cail of the Waccamaw Indian people. And then we also have Talia Landry of, and I'm blanking on your organization. I'm so sorry, Talia. But yeah, so would y'all like to?
Sure. Meku everybody. My name is Crystal Cavalier, and I am the co-founder of Seven Directions of Service. And I work in Hazy. I work here in the community, um, protecting our waters and our land. We do an Indigenous environmental education throughout the community to everybody. And we try to build movements right now. We're working on the rights of nature. In our community, we have introduced House Bill 795 to the North Carolina General Assembly. It would be the first one in the state, first one in the nation that recognized the rights of a river at a state level. And then we do a lot of cultural revitalization in our communities. I grew up in Pleasant Grove, Alamance County, North Carolina, and I lived in DC for a while. And then when I moved home about 8 years ago, I wanted to just try to bring something back to my community as I was raising my kids in that community. And I wanted them to have something that I had when I was growing up. And so I'll save the rest for my presentation and I'll turn it back over to Dominique.
Thanks so much, Crystal. And Cheryl, would you like to introduce yourself? Oh,
Sure. Good morning. I should say good afternoon, depending on where you're coming in from, calling in from. My name is Cheryl Cail. I am the Vice Chief of the Waccamaw Indian People and current acting chief. I have no language to speak of that I can identify other than Siouan, so I identify my name as Ai Waka Padea Wambli, which is soaring eagle in Lakota Sioux. We're currently working on restoring language with some help from, I believe it's Dominique's cousin, Corey Roberts, and others. I returned to my ancestral homelands after my mother passed away, which was very significant for me. She passed away on Mother's Day, and 3 years earlier, we had visited the homelands on Mother's Day. So it was very directional for me. The journey for me and I call truth seeking really began before that. Trying to understand some things that didn't make sense. The curiosity of a child, the why did this happen? Um, why were these things going on? And particularly, why wasn't I told this stuff when I was growing up? So that led me to really become very involved with my tribe, um, and particularly in the research and understanding the stories, taking those stories, digging into history, and putting together this better understanding of what happened to tribal communities in South Carolina, particularly the Waccamaw. And that's kind of what my presentation is today. Um, Additionally, I work for American Rivers. I'm Associate Director of the North Coast of Conservation. So this is very meaningful because as I'm doing this work with conservation, I'm also understanding that there's a need to have a better understanding in conservation of the indigenous relationship to land. So that's another question I think is going to be answered in the presentation is how did this happen and how did we get here? Because I think that's the important part of identifying the what needs to be done is the answering that why question first. So I'll turn it back over to Dominique.
awesome. Thank you so much, Cheryl. And last but not least, Talia.
Waniki Sak, Natasuis Mashkwasat Manunash, Talia Landry. Good day, everybody. I am Talia Landry. My name is also Red Clay. I am from the Mashpee Wampanoag Tribal Nation, which is the people of the First Light. We're located in Massachusetts on Cape Cod. We have about 300 acres of reservation land separated, so 600 in total, but 300 in one town and 300 in another. It's very sporadic. We were newly formed, federally recognized in 2007, and then just received our land in trust in 2015, which was actually challenged, and it was probably reaffirmed, I believe, 2022 or 23 or so, was when the Department of Interior reaffirmed it through a lot of litigation. I have many hats within the Mashpee Wampanoag tribal community. I am the president of the Community and Development Corporation, which is the tribally chartered corporation for the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe. I'm a grants manager within the education department, which has led me to the positions that we'll be talking about a little bit more today within my land back acquisition called Revitalize 12 Acres, which is a project for a pre-contact traditional Wampanoag home site. And within that, we are trying to acquire land back from the town of Mashpee. And also we developed a new youth group called the Mashpee Wampanoag Native Environmental Ambassadors that is coordinated to educate and also put together rights of nature legislation to the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe. And their first campaign is the rights of herring. And they've gotten so far as to draft a law. So it's kind of at that stage of being passed or not. And within the revitalized 12 acres is a lot of cultural programming and revitalizing of the land and within our traditional values and ways for not only our youth, but our younger generation, that there has been a big disconnect. As we are first contact people, our assimilation years have been a lot and we're battling a lot of those challenges within our own existence of being able to be the Mashpee Wampanoag tribal nation that we know we are. So thank you guys all for having me today, and I'm really excited to have these conversations and tell you more about what we have going on here in Mashpee.
Thank you so much, Talia. So without further ado, we're going to first invite Vice Chief Cheryl Cail to present on her land rematriation projects that are going on in her community with the Waccamaw Indian people. So make sure that you're able to share your screen, Cheryl. Awesome.
Okay, as I was saying, I appreciate everybody joining us here today. I recognize especially working in conservation, there's been a lot of questions about how do we move beyond land acknowledgements to rematriation of tribal lands, particularly in the Southeast. And I think for me, because I just have to understand origin speaks to me so much. I wanted to really be able to utilize my time, resources wisely. So as pursuit of federal recognition is ongoing, it requires some very intensive research. And the research, and particularly in areas of the South, are somewhat challenging. As narratives have been geared towards erasure, there's also very clear, we call it genocidal by paper, that has occurred. And so I had questions, and this goes back to probably 30 plus years ago, sitting down with my grandmother on her deathbed, pulling out a pad of paper and just saying, okay, start talking to me. So she did, and she shared. And what she shared was just enough truth for me to move on. But there were questions that I had. As a child, I grew up, I was one of those kids that said why all the time, not in a whiny why, but why as in why I need to have understanding. And so as I think naturally a truth seeker, and being that your skills are honed to be able to perceive when something isn't quite the truth, and that causes you to move a little deeper into it. So let's see if I can get this to move. Okay. One of the first truths is that is recognizing that historians identify 3 reasons for the European conquest of the New World, and that's God, glory, and gold. And I'm going to give an overview of conquest and colonization of South Carolina, particularly kind of covering the doctrine of discovery, the grand model, and how that stewardship that Indigenous peoples have had for just centuries, and that relationship to land, how that model being brought over changed to exploitative, looking at land and animals and habitat is just resources, and that evolved from the plantation systems. And then going on from there to the expansionism, and how some of the methods that were kind of birthed from this doctrine of discovery and grand model gave rise to more indigenous land loss. And then with settlement Indians into the 19th century and the Manifest Destiny, it changed that whole concept of what indigenous communities looked like and how they operated. And a lot of that was just based on invoking fear and shame into our identities. So, and then the last is the where we are today. So I don't focus so much on the where we are today because it's still a story unfolding. But I can kind of give you the updates to where we are in the process. So, and if you guys can look at this, this next slide, and I'm not expecting you to be able to see the details on the map, but this map that is here is Columbus, and of course, referring to how he sailed and missed his mark and trying to find that spot to that route to the Eastern Asia and the Spice Islands. But it's significant because in 1492, it really truly began Spain's race for conquest of the New World. Within just a short amount of time, just within 3 decades, you had De Soto, Cordelia de Ayllon, and others that were commissioned by Spain to continue this exploration and conquest of the New World. So resulting from what occurred with Columbus, they wanted to really assure and assert their rights to claims to all these new lands that were not under a Christian king. And this little, this writ, this edict, or they call the Papal Bull Inter Cetera, issued by Pope Alexander VI in 1493, it confers upon them based on Christianity, based on the religious beliefs, certain things as far as not just the land, but the people. And so this gives rise to disenfranchisement, dispossession, and everything from that point really is where the shift happens, where things move to impact Indigenous people in a very prevailing way. So in this, the document which supported Spain's strategy to ensure its exclusive rights to lands discovered by Columbus the previous year, it was a demarcation line 100 leagues west of Azores, Cape Verde Islands, and it assigned Spain the exclusive right to acquire territorial possessions and to trade in all lands west of that line. And when you read this, you understand that they really literally thought from one pole to the other, from west. I mean, just it was conquering everything. So it's really significant because it was part of what is understood is that they believe that wherever they placed their flag, that was it. It wasn't just that we're here, we arrived safely. It was, this is ours. So some of this through the Catholic faith and the Christian religion, they of course wanted to exalt that and they wanted to increase that and spread that. And this gave this doctrine of discovery gave rise and became the basis of all European claims of Americas, as well as the foundation of the United States and Western expansion later on. And I'm going to kind of run through this because it's really important to see how things happen in South Carolina, particularly. So as I said, it was about 3 decades after Columbus landed in the West Indies that you had Cordelia and Vasquez de Ayllon, who enslaved indigenous people from the land of Jacora. Now, that's very close to where I live in an area called Winyah Bay. Believed that he encountered the Winyah Indians, and they captured some of the indigenous people, brought them to the West Indies, sold them into slavery, but they kept one young man named Francisco, or they called Francisco de Jacora, which is Francisco from the land of Jacora, as he was baptized. Then when they returned, he attempting to settle in San Miguel de Guadalupe, he ends up escaping, and then it's a while before De Soto returns back. Some of the things I think occurring at that time were they were encountering other natives that maybe had gotten wind of what was happening. But he does go in to begin exploring the interior west of Savannah, and meets the Cofetachique, which there is a legend that's told about that encounter with the lady. And I've put a QR code for anybody who likes to explore further, because that's just available. It's a very interesting story, and a YouTube video that the Catawba have prepared. So we go forward a little bit, and you see some years are going by. It takes a bit to commission the ships and get them sent over, but France joins in at this point into the attempts at settlement. And you have this competition between France and Spain at this point for Charles Fort, which is present day area of Charlestown. It hasn't been settled yet, but they're trying to establish the settlement. And they land in Port Royal. And then what occurs at this point, because the Spanish are conquistadors, they are very vicious in their dealings with people. They end up killing two chiefs, and the two tribes, the Gola and the Rista tribes, attack and drive the Spanish, from the area down to the area of St. Augustine, Florida. And at that point, they kind of move off the radar for the Eastern Seaboard. They're more in the area of the West Indies, establishing sugarcane plantations, and in establishing a slave system that would be modeled later on when the English arrive and finally settle the area and establish Charlestown. The thing that was done with that is the English had, with the help of John Locke, they had something called the Grand Model that was laid out. And this was not just a model of how settlements would be laid out, even though it absolutely was, because there's very specific ways that they divided up into 8 seigneuries, 8 baronies, 4 precincts, and how they actually comprised these settlements. But it was also a governmental system. And so, as you can see in the seal that the Lord Proprietors developed, it was Magnum Sigillum Caroline Dominorum, to dominate and conquer the world. So they were laying, essentially establishing their mark and claiming, as the papal bull had stated, the lands were now theirs, because they were establishing that Christian rule and domination. I think one of the things that's interesting is how they kind of put the spin, tamed by the husbandmen or cultivators of the world, how they saw themselves as husbandmen, to care for, to bring the heathens to Christianity, to establish and save their souls. And it really is about domination. So we see this as we move through history. That's the groundwork that's laid out. It's not just laid out in the land concept, but it's laid out in the social concept and how colonists are going to deal with the indigenous people. So it is never really a relationship. It's not a relationship with land. It's not a relationship with people. It's only about extractive and exploitative. What they can benefit, whether it's through trade, and that could be trade with the resources, as they call, available, or people. So that gives rise to this Native American slavery system that occurs before the African slave trade is developed. It also just establishes a very closely resembled feudal system. And you can see this all throughout what is in written documents, and how, interestingly enough, there was a small revolution in South Carolina in 1719 that threw out this system. The colonists decided that they did not like this proprietary system and started to take ownership of their own dominion. So how did this merging of religion and law impact Indigenous people, and particularly in the Southeast? But it definitely went through as it migrated, as expansionism happened. It was that foundation that continued on. So through this doctrine of discovery, the Papal Bull, we see that was Spain's kind of foundational laying of conquering. And then the grand model was the establishment, the common law, the way things would be in in society. And what it gave rise to was entitlement, superiority, and dispossession. And later on, you see the through things like such as the Revolutionary War Pensions Act, which established bounty land grants for Indian vacant lands for a period of time. The this also allows for decisions in our own Supreme Court under the Marshall Trilogy to disenfranchise um, indigenous populations, indigenous nations that have valid treaties with the United States. And then the impact later on into the 19th century is the settlement Indians. And that's where my people end up, on the kind of bottom of the barrel when it comes to the indigenous relationships, trying to navigate between this, what the government says that they are at times when it benefits them, and what the government says they are not. And so we're in this very volatile situation as state tribes, especially in the Southeast, because of this. I wanted to show a couple of things. This is Herbert's map of South Carolina from 1727. It really clearly identifies the Waccamaw, the Savannahs, the Shaw's, the PD, right within very close proximity to each other. And this is just 30, or I'm sorry, 50 years after the English begin to settle. So what's really important is you can see at the bottom how they have broken down with these squared off settlements. They haven't quite reached where we are, but we are being kind of protected in a sense because we're living very close proximity to each other. Um, and interestingly enough, as you can see that the Waccamaw still exists, the narrative that has been put out and often used even today, as recent as 15 years ago, that there was a war that the Waccamaw were involved in 1720. And words like the Waccamaw were eradicated are still today used. And that is in historical surveys, and things that matter when it concerns land and land use. Um, I apologize. I'm still, we keep going to the wrong mouse to click. But as I was saying, this Papal Bull, the doctrine of discovery, the grand model, all of these things were what made the European countries, later the United States, able to exploit the new lands during this time period. And it did provide the Europeans automatically the right property rights in native lands and in political clout, governmental control, and then rights over indigenous inhabitants without their knowledge or consent. When there are, we can say all the treaties were broken, but there were ones that were not ratified. And yet, even with that being said, the treatment was fairly the same, except for there was the idea of if you can stay in the state and be in amity, um, you're living on this really volatile situation. You have to very seriously behave, because then there are laws that come up to impede on your right to just live freely. Um, so later you see by 1776, the same area, if you look in the center of this map, you can see where it shows Indian Town. And that is the same area where early you had seen the 4 different tribal nations and villages rather living in that same area. So it's just within one generation that this has changed. That does not mean that the people are no longer there. They're being confined more into what we call settlements, and also reduced and somewhat erased through some other constructs. And so one of the things that's really significant is also in this time frame, it's the period of the Revolutionary War. The Pension War Act follows up with, I believe, it begins about 10 years after the conclusion of the war. And these are when bounty land grants start to be given out for those who've served. Your first claims to high-ranking officers, and then to those of lesser rank, and finally to those who had volunteered if they were lucky. And many of the indigenous people volunteered to fight on either side. Unfortunately, there were also many indigenous nations who fought on the wrong side, the Choctaw being one. They allied with the British, and of course, they forfeited all of their lands. So through this, and I'm just about done here, so I'm trying to watch time. We have the assimilation and elimination, loss of culture, language, and community. And there are some examples I've given here. Your forced changes to the relationship Native American or indigenous people had to land, the Christianizing, which was really truly the only way if to hold title to land for a good period of time. So some of the indigenous population in the Southeast took on Christian names just for the purpose of being able to have some way to have land that people could dwell on. And they tried still living in more of a community type settlement. But then you have this cultural pushback and being forced into this racial identity crisis through census record documentation, through imposing slave codes on free people of color, and the capitation taxes. So these are also efforts they're oppressive efforts to enable the population of colonists still at that point, because they really were still colonizing, to take ownership of land through legal means. And then the last one, which is really very significant for my family, was having this legal incompetency declared based on practicing of traditional ways, based on identifying as an indigenous person. And that gave rise to guardianships. So during the same time that this is happening, and I'll go into the next slide so you can see, just touching base on, there are also the Indian Offenses Act that was established, but that was much later on. And that was probably more so a result of the ghost dances and those spiritual activities that were threatening to people. So this one, this capitation tax and guardianship, this is my great grandfather, John Demery, who had this tax imposed on him because he was listed as a free person of color. And it says for free Negroes, mulattoes, etc. So this was an additional tax imposed on the land that he owned. And this was done, they call later on, I think, the Jim Crow laws, but as those laws applied kind of arbitrarily, it covered also in the Southeast those that identified as indigenous. And then the other situation that arose from the decisions of the Marshall Trilogy and particularly in Cherokee v. Georgia, the counties had taken that as a way to establish the imposition of guardians over Indigenous people. So John Demery, his son, his other son, and James, which is one of my great great grandfathers, were essentially forced to have guardians um, over their land and anything to do with their land. And this was just another method of being able to take land away. None of the lands ended up staying within their families. We currently have 18 acres of our land, what would be called the Demery settlement. And that 18 acres is where our tribal powwow is held. We have activities going on there. But I want to say that we are, in spite of it, resilient, and we're still here today. So this is South Carolina Tribes Today. As you can see, there's a number of tribes. There's 9 state recognized tribes in South Carolina, and that's in the red. You have 1 federally recognized tribe, the Catawba, up in Rock Hill, and that's in the blue. You have some special interest groups, and you have state recognized groups as well. Interestingly, in the last few days, I found this map that was through Open Parks Network. I'm doing a lot of work on the Black River State Park and incorporating Indigenous access to it, space for us to have intertribal ceremony, and working with other tribes to have that space opened up on this first state park in South Carolina in over 20 years. So this was found there as I was doing some research. And if you feel free to also QR code that, because it's an interesting map that was developed in the 1950s, identifying the tribes in the state. So I just wanted to share a little bit. This is myself and the chief as we're moving to finally have Indigenous Peoples Day, and that happened a little less than 4 years ago. We're developing, and have been through especially the hard work of Chief Hatcher, some really strong relationships with politicians, although Senator Greg Embry does not aspire to conservation in the same way, as I recently encountered him at Lobby Day, and he kind of pushed back. He called me an anti-development person, so, which is fine. But I have some strong women around me through the Indigenous Women's Alliance, and this was our conference for Indigenous Women's Alliance at Catawba about 5 years ago. And I think that that's the important part, is that we develop relationships and collaborate and work with even leaders that don't necessarily see eye to eye. Important thing is to tell the story, to hopefully change, to expose the truth, and not make it about how much wrong has been done, but what can we do now to correct these things and right this ship, because we absolutely cannot change what has happened in the past. So I'm not here to try to do that, or guilt anybody. It doesn't really last anyways. It is to build relationships and to move forward. And rebuilding tribal community from the pieces of our past. This is one of the projects that we worked on that was a museum project with collaboration from CCU. They are such strong partners, Coastal Carolina University. The professors are phenomenal, and have become dear friends in the process of working with us. I think that if you would like, obviously, another QR code, you can visit virtually our museum exhibit. So I'm going to stop now because I probably went over a bit, and pause for questions.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. Be safe. And if there is anyone who has questions, since we're running a little bit over, feel free to drop them in the chat. And then when we do the panel Q&A, we can always make sure that those are answered. And Vice Chief Cheryl can address those. Thank you, Bisa, again, Cheryl. I'm actually going to drop our Indigenous East, and throughout our time here together, I'm going to be dropping some resources here in the chat for everyone. And I just dropped our website if you haven't already seen it. We will be doing some updates, including our mapping project, but I wanted to share that. And without further ado, we're going to now have Dr. Crystal Cavalier, and we're going to pull up her presentation.
Perfect. Thanks, Dominique, for sharing those. Meku, everybody. So again, Crystal Cavalier with 7 Directions of Service. And I just want to say some of the history that Cheryl was sharing. I will be briefly talking about it, but here on the North Carolina, Virginia side. So I just kind of wanted to talk about rematriation. And it's kind of funny how I got into this, and I never knew there was a word for it. Rematriation that weaves traditional and cultural knowledge back in harmony with the land. When I was a little girl growing up out in Pleasant Grove, my grandparents were farmers and school teachers, and that is what most of our community was a farming community. So Dominique, you can go to the next slide. So I wanted to share this picture for you. So this picture was taken in the 1930s of my great-grandparents' land. And our land joins right up to it. My grandparents my great-grandparents had over 30 acres of land. And then they split it up among their 7 children. And so my grandparents had a piece of property since the 1940s. And so we have worked hard to keep that in our family. And we have several ongoing relationships with cities and towns, institutions, individuals, and organizations to help rematriate stolen land in our area, as well as developed relationships. Because all of this is based on healing the harm that has been done for 500 years and, healing everybody, all, perpetrators or receivers of the harm. And this is how we're going to heal our land. And so what I have researched and understood what rematriation is it's an Indigenous women-led work to restore sacred relationships between Indigenous people and our land, and honoring our matrilineal societies and in opposition of patriarchal violence and dynamics. So we see how our Western mainstream dominant government and society is based on. So again, like I said, our farmlands in Alamance County have been in our family for over 200 years. But my community came here around the 1790s. We migrated down from the Virginia area, Mecklenburg. And the gardens that my husband and I named is called Yesa Nedewahe Saponi Tudelo Indigenous Community Gardens. And we already have a space, which is on my grandparents' land. And let me see. Can you go to the next slide, Dominique? I don't know if it's going to show that. Oh, okay. So you can see here at the top right and the bottom right, this is the land that is current today. This is Pleasant Grove. And we have already started working in our space, having community gardens. We had a teaching ceremony about 7 years ago, braiding the sacred from the Onondaga Nation came down and gifted us some seeds back to our communities that they were holding. And so we planted in the traditional method in the mounds, and in the last couple of years, we advanced into hydroponics to try to grow food for our family and for our community when COVID happened. And we are reinstituting some agricultural practices and teachings that was passed down in our family. So like I said, my family were farmers. That was our main staple. From my grandmother's side, and my grandfather's side, they were farmers. We grew tobacco and sweet potatoes. But we decided that we wanted to give more to our community and we needed to develop these programs because not just growing food, but having some sense of community. And like I said earlier, when we moved home from DC, me and my children, I wanted them to have this joy that I experienced growing up out in the rural community. And, you know, back in those days, I can't believe I'm saying that, but back in the day, in the 80s, we didn't have a lot of TV. We had a computer and it was not hooked up to the internet because it had not been invented yet. And we had just a regular color TV. So I had to do a lot of my expanding outdoors. And so I really got a grounding for nature. And then my grandmother, she was also a gardener and she loved houseplants. And so I got my green thumb from her. And so we in the Southeast, we rarely see natural areas that are Indigenous run or serve the needs of BIPOC communities, focusing on connection with the earth and earth skills. And so, you know, through this process, I've taken a lot of classes, reached out to a lot of elders in different tribal communities to try to understand this holistic approach that we wanted to expand our garden. And now we have it situated and we want to create this outdoor sanctuary for our BIPOC community because we have experienced a lot of harms in the community. And like Cheryl was saying, American Indians here in the Southeast, especially in Virginia, North Carolina, and now I can say South Carolina, are mostly invisible to the general public. And where there's some semblance of awareness, there's implicit bias for most people or most of the public. Um, what they what people know is what they're taught in school. So generally, Indians are examined in one of two ways: that they are either relics of the past, lived in a teepee, that is that Plains Indian exploitation, or they hunted buffalo and were either savages or at one or one with nature, the mythical Indian or American Indians. And so that leaves people to study us like a tourist visiting a culture. And when people pass away in our communities or they leave the community and they don't speak their language anymore, they tend to forget their culture and their tie back to the community. So during the 1800s to about 1950s and even in the 70s, the current tribal community where I live, the number dropped. It was small and family farms, and it was 20 farms. And now in 2023, there was one farm in the community, and it was Enoch Farms. And the generation of the 40s, the 1940s, has now slowed and left the community due to the white supremacy agricultural policy here in North Carolina that has been placed on them. And it pushed all of the communities of color out. Economic opportunity is an all-time low. And you know, it was really traumatic on our community. So after the farming community left or the culture was pushed out, we had to rely on working in the mills in the industry. But then after that was pushed out, you know, people had to regroup and now they're working 2 or 3 jobs. So looking at all of this, talking to elders, talking to our community, I noticed that we needed a need for change. And so we needed to have some lasting impacts and get rid of these lasting impacts of colonialism, talk about the disparities in health and food access. And then we need to start understanding our reliance on non-Indigenous food sources. And that is where we started to develop these programs that we have here today at Seven Directions of Service, which we are building like internal capacity, sharing best practices in protecting Indigenous lands. We noticed that most tribal communities have barriers or limitations that hamper business people from taking advantage of all potential agribusiness opportunities. Such barriers are credit, usable land, technical assistance, markets, things like that. And so we're trying to help, one, educate the community and bring them up to the same speed as everyone else around us, but also we felt that we needed to bring some type of economic benefit to our own communities. And so we created this farming hub, and I know it's crazy. I'm talking a lot about topsoil, sequester, soil carbon. These are the words that are being used around in the government. And if we don't understand what these words are, we can't never function in a mainstream society. So again, at the top left picture you see here, this is the land that we just purchased last year in Halifax, Virginia. So one of our ancestral territories. We were able to purchase 22 acres. And if you could see on the map, there's kind of like the cutout, looks like a boot. That is actually the road that we had paved out, and we put rocks down. And if you can really see it, there's like three buildings on that property right now, and that is where we're holding most of our ceremonies and most of our indigenous teaching with our cultures. And we hope to build out in future with other partners, bringing this back to the community and actually having this be a community resource and land access. And this bottom picture is the picture that we just got our land back. So last year we almost lost it due to sickness in our family. My mom did not have a will or trust, and she had a stroke, and her mind was kind of lost. And so she was taken advantage of by some nefarious people in the community, and they actually sold her land. And so we actually had to get an attorney and fight to get it back. And so we successfully won, and we won our case, and we were able to get our land back in our hands. And so now we're moving forward with building up our community with we have I can't remember the name of it. We have a building that we're adding to it. So when we start growing our siege, which is coming up, that we will be able to do that, protect it from the frost that might develop or come back with this fall spring that we're having. And so that way we can grow things that way. Dominique, next slide, please. So I didn't want to talk about my community without letting you guys see some of my ancestors. So John Will Jeffries on the left, he is my great uncle. And then Elton Jeffries, Cliff Hayth, JP Hayth, Bill Hayth, and Joe Jeffries, and Jake Jeffries. The Jeffries are all of my first cousins. And then the Hayths, Bill Hayth is my grandfather, and JP and Cliff are my uncles. And these are the people that really instilled in me our farming practices, also some of the culture that we have today, and just trying to help understand and build our community back. And so I wanted to use this community guided approach and build back this Indigenous leadership, focusing on our revitalization of our language, customs, and traditions, tied back to these land-based agricultural experiences since we were stewards of the land. We also have seen an uptick in threats that are coming to our communities. So we have a lot of hot asphalt plants that are popping up. We have a lot of mining moratoriums that have been lifted in Virginia and right across the border in North Carolina. And so what we're doing is doing an educational awareness to these communities to letting them know that, you know, these are resources or minerals that they have on their properties. But you know, how can we protect the land? How can we protect us as people? And how can we protect nature in the same kind of dynamic? Next slide, please, Dominique. So again, more of my ancestors, I just wanted to show how proud we are in our community here in present day. Just about everybody in this picture has passed on. Yeah, everybody in this picture has passed on, but we wanted to instill that proudness that we had before all of these Jim Crow laws of today have come into place. So with that being said, that is my presentation about land rematriation. And this is how you guys can reach us. So thank you so much Bisay.
Bisay, thank you so much, Crystal, for sharing. I love seeing the family photos. I feel like that's just so important, the history, family, what we're seeing right now. And again, this is a kind of little snippet. The Indigenous East is helping members of our network to, connect with one another for both moral support, for practical support, and also for technical assistance. So again, if you're in a land rematriation project or you work with those who are or do or want to, be sure to visit our site and reach out to us. Alrighty, so next up we have Talia, and she's going to present about 12 acres in the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe.
All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you again. Can you guys see that? I have a few different screens up, so I can't tell what you can see. Again, good day, and thank you all for joining us today and having this really good dialogue. So one of the projects I mentioned that I want to talk to everybody about today is Revitalize 12 Acres. So just a little background on Mashpee and who we are. So the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe, or the Mashpee reservation, we were a protected plantation. So we were organized as praying Indians. So we were protected and protected for some time. So in 1672, the court confirmed Mashpee as an Indian township, and it basically gave us the deed of the traditional boundaries of what Mashpee was, which was basically a 50-mile radius, or down to a 25-mile radius up to 2024 now. But in 1672, it was about 50 miles, and it was set aside for us, for the Mashpee Indians, to only be for the Mashpee Indians and our children forever, and to never be sold or alienated without consent from all of us as a unit. So that was what protected us and why we stayed where we were for so long, as everything around us was being developed. In 1693, the tribe was placed under guardianship by 5 white men supervisors or overseers. So they were the ones that were doing a lot of the handlings as far as trades and agreements and things like that. We had many petitions to the governors to say, that they're not acting in the right way, they're not looking out for us. So it got to be some time of that in 1752 when we petitioned the governor to send relief for us, because the guardianship was not working. And then by that point, there was a lot of non-Mashpees that were squatting on tribal lands, and they were actually like beating and harassing Mashpee Wampanoags as we were trying to fish the rivers. So there was a lot of communication between the tribe and the newly formed government within Massachusetts Bay Colony and overseas. So, and then by 1833, Mashpee became increasingly disturbed with all of the outsiders coming in. They were taking a lot of our wood. So that's when the time of what they call the wood riot happened. And this was basically, it wasn't what we think of as a riot, but basically because we were praying Indians and we were cooperative and kind of, doing what we were supposed to do to stay protected. When a truck came in to take a load of wood out, some of our Mashpee men flipped over the truck because obviously they were getting fed up with them coming to take all of our resources and us not being able to have a say within that. And obviously they were depleting our resources along the way. It was also the time when William Apis overthrew Reverend Phineas Fish, who at the time was he was a non-tribal person, Phineas Fish, and he was supposed to be, converting the Wampanoag Nation, and he wasn't looking in the best interest for the Wampanoag Nation. He was, not allowing us into the Sunday services, or he was making, tribal members sit in the back for different services. So William Apis came to us. He was a Pequot tribal member that came to, preach to us. And he really led a lot of the petitioning and fighting and advocating because he was that dignitary in that way. So by 1842, the state of Massachusetts partitioned off the land held in common by the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe. So that deed that was in 1672 was basically like disestablished in 1842, excuse me, in order to separate the land. So obviously we know now why that was done. to give, each Mashpee Wampanoag tribal person their 60 acres of land to be held responsible. They're held responsible. That individual was held responsible of that land. So by 1870, we held a town meeting to see if we wanted to be incorporated into a town and be, citizens, American citizens. According to our meeting minutes, we voted twice, and within both of those votes, we voted no. But the state of Massachusetts, so they incorporated us into a town. So obviously, what that does is that put tax implications on us, and not too long before that, they divided up the land, so everybody was individually responsible for that land. So that's how we started losing all of our land, not being able to, keep up with this foreign system, because for all that time we were operating within our Indian, plantation, our Indian settlement. We weren't really going outside within that way to be able to generate the revenue to even pay for these taxes. So it was you can see throughout the history of Mashpee and what was going on, that it was very thought out of what was happening at the time, to a point of where it is today, where we only have not even 300 acres in the town of Mashpee itself. And as the time went on, we held a lot of our own positions up until about the 1970s. So we were in, the select board positions, we were in the police and things like that, the fire. But by the 70s, there was a big influx of non-tribal members coming to town, and they started kind of positioning themselves in their way so they can reach the development as much as it was around us on Cape Cod. So that's kind of one of our biggest challenges in Mashpee, is the overdevelopment and overpopulation within our homelands. And it's gradually been happening since the 70s and since before, but we've seen it rapid from the 70s. So the project is actually grant funded by the Department of Education. And the mission of the project is to recreate the 12 acres village site to traditionally educate the tribal community and general public on accurate Wampanoag history and culture through interactive pre-contact homestead exhibits. So a little background of this site, we call it 12 acres because that's kind of our traditional way of calling it from like the 70s. It was a recreational sort of area during that time. There was the same concept, the same project was executed in the 70s, and it was actually a grant that filtered through the town, and it was a job creation grant. So during that time, they made these structures at the same spot that I'm determining, or that we're trying to acquire right now. And it was actually, it was during the American Indian movement, and a few months after that is when the tribe filed a land suit against the town of Mashpee. So it was a very intense time. That actually, there's a documentary called Mashpee 9, and there's also a book that goes along with it that describes the altercations that happened there. So through that project, at the end of that season, when they were kind of celebrating everything that was happening there, because it was the youth camp, it was, the grant people that were hired by the grant, it was the community that all came together to build these traditional structures. During one of the celebrations at the end of during the summer, the police from all different towns around Cape Cod came and raided the village site, and they arrested 9 of our men. They actually arrested 10, but 1 was let go because he was underage. And it was a very, violent and radical time. And the documentary and the book goes into that and what actually came of that. But basically that squashed that project. So a project that was really kept the community going and kept our traditions going. It's in a very sacred space to us. It's in the area of the convergence of 2 waters at the pond called Mashpee Pond, Mashpee, where we get our name. So it's just, it's always meant to be there. And it was back in the 70s where it kind of got squashed by the town initially, for us to bring us to this point of wanting to recreate it because we know what it brought, but also to go after it within this way of acquiring it back for the tribe, just because of that, that history that we've been dealing with from that certain occasion and up to this point. And so the project contains different aspects of it. So it's basically supposed to bring you through a year, that we would traditionally live pre-contact before the colonizers came over. So, we have a winter home site that shows our winter structures, as well as winter activities like post-hunting, things like that. It'll have its own flint napping area on the side. You then get to, the fall. what you would do certain things during then, and then the spring and the summer, with those our different homesteads and how we would cover our different homesteads depending on the season, how the smaller homesteads for the summer and the bigger for the winter, like I said, the different activities, the garden, and so on and so forth. So it's a very extensive project. This is the layout of the land. And as you can see, the red area is the 3 parcels that we went after. And the water is obviously the pond. If you could see where 414 is, that is our current, that's actually land in trust right now where our Indian Museum is. So this would hopefully be kind of an extension off the museum like it was intended in the 70s as well. So within that, this is kind of a better representation of what it would look like structurally within the village, within all the different structures. As you can see, it won't be completely cleared out. We're going to be moving around our landscapes and really showing the community how we traditionally live and within our values. Because through this process, we are seeing more and more the differences of values and us having to reiterate ourselves or re-explain things in different ways because the Western values are not able to comprehend what we're saying. So this is really important within the education process of getting this passed. So basically, we got this grant in 2021. We didn't really start to get things going until 2022, where we created a cultural advisory council that is basically made up of Wampanoag culture keepers that know different aspects of creating this village site project. A few of them worked on the village site in the 70s, and they really determined what we could do with the money that we had in our timeline and the objectives that we needed, which is obviously is education, cultural revitalization within our own people, but education within our teachers and local community. And so we didn't automatically think we were going to go after town land. We looked at all of our properties, we assessed them. We kind of gave the tribal council our option of like, if we have to do it on tribal property, this is where we can do it at. But we would really like the support to seek more property of town property. So they agreed to support us. So I initiated those conversations with the town manager, the town planner, to really engage in a community project. But as probably a lot of people have experienced within their own sort of journeys within this avenue, is there was not much communication. There wasn't a lot of feedback. There was, general support like, yeah, we support what the tribe does, or we're here for you. But there was no commitment. There was nothing really substantial that I could move off of. So as the summer came, I submitted a citizens petition, because I'm a Mashpee resident as well, that basically just authorized the select board to transfer over those 3 separate parcels to the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe. I presented to all the boards, all the town boards. I didn't get support from the town boards. I did from the Community Preservation Commission and the Historical Commission and the Diversity and Inclusion Commission, but I did not get support from the Select Board. I didn't get support from the Finance Committee. None of those kind of key players within town meetings that actually say their recommendation supported the article. But it actually passed in a landslide. So all of the residents, I did a lot of outreach and a lot of education and a lot of feedback, in being born and raised in Mashpee, not only as a tribal person, but as, a town citizen, because I went through their public school system. I was raised, with non-natives. We grew up within the school system together. My generation and the ones that have been here kind of understand the project and the importance of it. And so that's kind of where it was sold, and that's why we won by so much. I think the vote was 393 was yes, and 79, I believe, was no. So we really won by a landslide. It really showed where the Mashpee residents' heads at and what their values are and how they align with the tribes. And it also showed how the boards that are representing them are not on the same page as them, because it was very difficult to get any support, let alone any opinion even spoken about from these, politicians and the select board and the finance committee. And a lot of these people that are in these positions have come just within their adult life. So they were not born and raised in Mashpee. So they don't have the same value system as a lot of our residents that have been here for so long. So those are kind of some of the challenges that we were facing. So lead us to after the vote, in November and December, the tribal council officially was reaching out to the town to start this negotiations, because the vote just authorized the select board to go into conversations. It didn't compel them, which was just a fancy way to say they don't have to do it. But the town is telling them that they want to do it. So we waited for correspondence. They said they needed to get appraised. They said they're looking into deed restrictions. They said, you know, they're only going to let the councils talk, blah, blah, blah. And then get it to the point of January where I'm getting a little fed up. I'm not seeing any movement. So I presented to our tribal council to come up with a task committee so that we can diligently work on this, knowing tribal council has a lot more obligations, that within the deed restrictions, within the legalities of the state and things like that, that this committee can come together to have those conversations with the town manager to see where the concerns are, to vet out all the options that we can. So that was created by tribal resolution. That for about 2 months was still, the town was hesitant about it. We notified the town manager, he didn't communicate back. He was still reluctant. So it wasn't until about a week ago that when I went to the select board meeting that I kind of called them out, that the select board, or that the town manager contacted us to be able to meet. So that's good news that I could actually report to this, you know, group today, as far as us being able to start that discussion with the town manager, because we weren't getting anywhere. So what was proposed is that we come up with an MOU by this March 11th date to be agreed upon, so we can start the project on the property for the spring and April, and then kind of expose the community and our partnering schools during May and June when we're actually constructing the project, to really show them what it's about. There's still a lot of, you know, when we spoke to the town manager, there's still a lot of reluctancy. It's quite funny because the biggest things that they're worried about from going to the map is that parking lot and beach area right there. They're worried about it being closed to the public because that's their only public beach. Obviously, we didn't turn the whole pond, all the properties that touch the pond, into private beaches. That was them. So for them to throw that sort of stuff in our face is kind of like, yeah, well, what did you expect? You did that to yourself. So now that there's public property left, you're trying to say that the tribal people can't take it, even though that's where we get our name. Like, that's our ancestral homelands, that's our rights. And even within that, you can see a little square where it says 40. The church, the Baptist church, actually owns that little bit of property, so they can have their baptisms and stuff. So there's a lot of different partnerships that have been happening with the town, with the church, with the Boys and Girls Club, where they're giving properties and disposing it and leasing it out for these projects to build and get rid of like a lot of trees and conservation lands. Yet anytime the tribe comes with something to get the land actually back within our possession, especially to turn it into land and trust, there's a lot of reluctancy. There's a lot of ignorance. And it's more from, like I said, the actual leaders that are put in those positions than it is from the residents. The residents are much more open. They appreciate the culture and the heritage, and they know where they're at. And that's really important for us, you know, as Mashpee people and as Indigenous people, in order to be able to really combat this climate crisis that we're in. So a lot of the challenges that we face as Mashpee people, as I mentioned, is the overdevelopment. So within the overdevelopment, they have blocked a lot of our access to our, you know, ancestral homelands, and they've also polluted a lot of, you know, our resources to a point where they are completely depleting. Like, we barely have any eelgrass. Our scallops are right down there with them. We've had a herring moratorium for the state for non-natives to not take it for almost 20 years now, and the herring count is still not up. With just the amount of people here, we have over nitrogen within the waters because they thought it was a good idea to dump poop in the water. So now we're dealing with this climate crisis where we're losing all of our resources. We're losing our fish, we're losing our land, we're losing our water. So this project is trying to show them, you know, as a federal sovereign government, what we can do, and as the, you know, with our traditional ecological knowledge, how we can benefit our nature, our homelands and our environment around us. That is really necessary for us to be able to progress. Because at this rate, if it's held in their hands and within their decisions, we're not going to be able to live here much longer. You know, our sea levels are rising. We're getting even deeper and deeper. There's too much going on. And now Cape Cod is officially an island. Like, the whole canal is demolished to a point where there's no connection anymore. So it's really, they're pushing us to a point of having to, you know, stand up and fight within this way and do it more radical. And so that's kind of the thing that led us to this. And this would just be kind of our first, you know, land acquisition project that can show the community, but we're hoping that this really triggers something. Because we don't, like I said, we don't have access to our resources, even water. We don't have any property that touches water. So, and because we are coastal people, we are, water people, it's really imperative for us to have this sort of access. We've always retained our Aboriginal rights. That's why it kind of took us so long to get federally recognized, because when we were approached about within the federal recognition process, we could have been federally recognized if we were willing to give that up, and we weren't. So we stayed strong, and we really fight for that in the Commonwealth up until this day. Because a lot of government agencies aren't educated in what that means, and a lot of property owners aren't educated in what that means. So our traditional, tribal fishers and hunters are being harassed on a daily basis for just trying to access, our traditional ways. And even within this cultural revitalization project of the things that we need to do, we're getting back to learning how to make bulrush mats and cattail. So we're getting to harvest those materials more. And, within our way, the more that we harvest, the more that they'll grow. So because there's been a disconnect for so long, we're really thinking that this project is not only going to, revitalize that area of what it needs to be, but it's going to revitalize the whole environment around us and really get our Indigenous plants back to the place that they need to be, and then our youth more confident and more educated in who they are, so we can continue to exist, as Mashpee Wampanoag people. And that's kind of what I had. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Talia. I love the what I saw as kind of the analogy between your ancestors fighting the logging trucks and y'all fighting the climate crisis and the rising sea levels and everything. And there's really a thread of the Indigenous values that we've talked about here today, as far as protecting the land and family and healing. So without further ado, we're going to jump into the Q&A portion. And that way it gives us plenty of time to kind of extrapolate on these questions. If anyone has questions, feel free to drop them in either the Q&A or in the chat, whatever's accessible to you. One of either Alexa and I will grab them. And to kind of kick us off, we have a few questions of our own. So the first question, and feel free, panelists, to unmute as you'd like to and answer as you'd like to. The first question we have is that Eastern Indigenous communities have suffered greatly from forced assimilation, land loss, and community fragmentation. How is this work uniquely challenging or impactful for your community, or for Indigenous communities in the East overall, from your experience? What are some of the barriers that you've encountered, and how have you overcome them? And I'm actually going to drop this live in the chat, if that works with everybody, so that panels can refer back to it. I know that's a really big question.
I'm more than happy to answer that. 30 years of experience in dealing with this, as you move through this timeline of seeing what happened in your community and how things happen. And I say we move through this process of grief always coming from the loss that was shared culture, shared knowledge, and then of course, I always go back to the why, because that was the kid I was, still the adult. And understanding, after I moved beyond anger to understanding that my ancestors were living during a different time. That might have meant they had to hide their identity, hide their practices. Fear and shame was so attached. So part of the process is really moving our older folks to a place of outside of that fear and shame first, because so many are afraid, or as my mother used to say, I just don't want to talk about it. And it took so long for her to really break free from that. So I think on that level, it has to happen from there. And then it's the challenging part of the efforts of being erased or written out of history, not being relevant, or as you're told, there's just not enough significance to the Indigenous history for South Carolina to include this part into the history books. So it's moving again back to okay, I can stay in that grief period of the loss, but then I get angry. And one of the things my father taught me after I had gotten into so much trouble in school for fighting was to use that anger in a way that's going to achieve something good. And so I think that's, I guess, the answer to how do you move past some of those barriers? It's not staying angry and resentful. It's taking it and moving people, um, and then putting truth in front of people. And when truth is in front of people that have lived for so long, either being oblivious to truth or they are just simply truth deniers, because maybe it fits their agenda better. And I'm talking about like land developers, those that have, I say, blood on their hands, so to speak. It's very hard to stay in a place that is, sorry about that, a place of denial. And it's also that part of what my grandmother used to say: lies have no legs, but they can take wings and fly, and it's a hard bird to put back in the cage. So what I'm trying to do is put a bird back in the cage. I think the part of finding documentation has been the most frustrating thing, but I've also found that there's ways, to find documentation in uniquely different places, maritime, things that are going to give us more of the story. And that's really what I'm trying to do is recreate the story of our people and in the community, and then focus on my own community and amplify that story, because really the foundation has to be from collaboration, from the strength of we have truth on our side, we have the evidence of this truth, and we can go and argue from that very strong place. So I will say that that's how I've overcome, or how we have been overcoming, is really getting truth out there.
Cheryl.
Hey, thank you so much, Dominique. So in our community, um, we have had this small, tight-knit community, and what we have encountered was probably a lot of racism in our community from outside sources. So when my mom was 5, um, there was a Klan burning, cross burning in our yard by the Klan. And so we have had to work together and just hold our community really tight. They focused around the church in our community. So we have 3 churches in our community in Pleasant Grove, and then in our larger community, including the Maven Oaks community, there's actually 2 more churches added to that. And so they've really relied on their religion experiences. And that's what really helped the community come together to try to overcome some of those boundaries. And also, my grandparents, they always wanted the best for their kids and their grandchildren. And they always said that there's nothing here for you. We want you guys to go out and do great things. So essentially asking us to leave the community because they knew that there was nothing here because of how racist the society had been towards them and how secluded the communities were. Like, we've read studies saying that, back in the 30s, when there was less transportation or less cars on the road, that it was hard for communities to get out to other communities and have, what's that word, safety, or, kind of a common ground that people could have, like in different communities, like different indigenous communities. So we were always isolated. But when, modern things happened and integration happened, a lot of our communities experienced a lot of trauma during that integration period. And I really believe that that is why a lot of our people who are over the age of 65 right now have a lot of trauma. We have a lot of people in our community that will not even say that they're indigenous. They've heard stories, but because our ancestors went and hid, or they hid who they were, it only took one generation for that to become erased. And so they kept, perpetrating that and passing it down through the next generation to, at one point, people really forgot who they were. And that also left a void in our community. So we've experienced a lot of drug problems, a lot of alcohol abuse, a lot of domestic violence. And so now we have started to see these things in the community and try to bring around these healing circles, letting people know that yes, it is okay for you to get mental help or seek, a therapy, but also giving them a safe space to be able to come and understand and learn some of the stories or oral histories that was passed down through the communities. And one of the things that I found was a listening project that was done over 20 years ago. And so being able to have that listening project and connect it to the community today, to have some of these youth hear their grandparents or great grandparents speaking about what it was like for them growing up. So again, it is sometimes our own community that we're having the problems or barriers with, not problems really, but barriers, because one, they don't know the education. Two, they've been told or reclassified as Black in our community. And so that is what they have acculturated into, is the Black dominant society, because they were always afraid that if they told that they were Indian, that their land would be taken, they would be taken away, they would be sent on the Trail of Tears. And we still have that fear today. Even with the census in our communities, people do not want to take the census because they're afraid that, it's something bad that's going to come and happen to them. So, again, it is a lot of trauma. And even my mom has experienced a lot of trauma. Even when I'm out here speaking out and doing the things that we're doing in the community, my mom has this concern or like genuinely care for my safety. And I'm just like, Mom, I think I'm going to be okay. And I understand where you're coming from. But, she's always had that concern because I've always been outspoken and standing up for, our civil rights as Indigenous people, and being able to freely claim who we are after we had to hide for so long. And then the last thing I like to leave is we always try to instill hope into our community. So like I always tell the young people, if you have dreams, don't let people say, well, you can't achieve that, or you can't do that, or that can't be accomplished. To try to rebuild that, as well as just listening back to just words of encouragement in this society and the times when people are moving at such a rapid pace and we're all moving towards individualism. We still have to instill that sense of community, because again, we're human beings and we thrive in a community mindset. All of us should have some type of community that we can call on hard times. And so that is how we've been able to overcome and encounter, and then bringing back some of these programs. So thanks, Dominique.
Say thank you so much. Thank you
Yeah,
so much, Crystal. Yeah,
I was
and
just gonna add a little bit to that. I mean, because all of us Eastern nations are really, we have a lot of the same challenges within assimilation and land loss and within our culture. And I just wanted to rebut, what Cheryl and Crystal were saying, because it's true. It's like literally our combat every single day. Not only are we combating outsiders on who we are, but we're competing within ourselves, not just like within ourselves as people, but like within each other, like as far as like, oh, you don't know this or you don't know that. Our older generation has that trauma, and so they're not talking as much about it. But then it left kind of our parents at this place of being very immersed within the colonization and kind of putting those values ahead, that now our youth are very, the colonization is very much present, so we're kind of having to instill these traditional values competing with their norm, like their American societal values and things like that. And there's like kind of a cross, and it's we're our biggest enemy really, because it's hit us so much and we've been assimilated for so long. So like Crystal was saying, with programming and just exposing them as much as we can, we rely heavily on our culture keepers because there's a little group of them that are able to go out and teach still. So just kind of getting to them as much as we can, exposing the youth And I have to say exposing, because when we try and tell them one way, they really go the opposite. So we really just have to like bring them to these places, let them talk and have their conversations and bring their friends. So that's a big thing that we've had to have to settle within ourselves, you know, as educators, is allowing, you know, non-natives to participate in our cultural like kind of programming sometimes. And it's because, you know, they're, you know, it's a best friend of a native kid. And if we're going to reach that native kid, then we need to invite what they're comfortable with. And it's just, you know, so we've had to accomplish that and had to be okay with that, and knowing that we're doing it for the right reasons, and also instilling our values within those non-native people, is seeing it as a better for the bigger picture. As I said, you know, being raised in the town that I have been, you know, on this, that has turned into, you know, a reservation. We've been immersed with non-natives, and knowing that they have been growing up with us side by side and exposed to certain things, they do have a different outlook than, you know, their grandparents and the people that are coming to retire here on Cape Cod. And it's so much more fruitful than what we've been seeing. So that's just the one thing I wanted to add, is really like one of our biggest challenges is within ourselves, and getting the youth to care, you know, to be able to carry out this generations, because what they're introduced right now in the public school system and through, you know, social media is not the same values that we hold traditionally. So it's a very big competition within themselves, that we just have to keep exposing them and showing them, you know, that it's a good time.
Thank you so much, Talia, and I appreciate that. I mean, we all are going through this together, right? And so for us to combat climate change, we we need we need our allies and we need our neighbors. And to what Crystal was mentioning earlier is that, you know, we are all in the community together, as long as we like had that end vision, the end goal of wanting not only the land but our communities to be protected. And to add what Crystal was sharing, I think this is something that gives some good perspective before we go on to the next question in the Q&A from one of our attendees, is that Crystal's family is from Alamance County. My family is from maybe 45 minutes away in Granville County, which was all Person County at one point. Anyway, you know, to what she was saying is that, you know, our families are related a few generations back, but we're just meeting, you know, recently. So that fragmentation is real. And also I wanted to share too that, you know, my own family has had to combat the Klan and things like that. So anyway, just kind of just share to show share to show that even just being a couple counties apart, our experiences are the same, yet we're just now hearing these stories from each other. So I feel that that's a real demonstration of the fragmentation and also the resilience that we're here today and we're sharing with you all. So thank you for listening. Our question.
If I can, I want to add one thing, just because I see these threads, these things that, you know, obviously are overlapping. And, you know, as you were mentioning the Klan and how that drives fear, there are still in the county I live in a Klan base that is not very far from our tribal grounds. And so I have to go through life saying, what is the worst they can do to me? And I joke around and say, well, I could end up in a swamp. And that somebody had told me, you know, you might not want to say that, because those are real things. And I recognize this because of the things my mother shared. She was born in 1929. It was a real threat for her growing up in the 30s, in the 40s. And so I'm one generation away, and I had to come to grips with her life was so dramatically different than mine. And I hope we never get back to that. So I really do hope that I don't end up in a swamp. But if I disappear for some reason, you guys, you know where to look for me.
Thank you for sharing, Cheryl. That's so important. I actually had a relative who's doing land rematriation work out in California, and she said the same thing. And unfortunately, no one has heard from her. So we really want to make sure we keep you safe. That's another part of Indigenous East. We want to do wilderness safety and being mindful that land rematriation work is goes hand in hand with what's happening in the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous people and women, especially our women and feminine folk who are leading rematriation. And so safety is a huge part of this. Not only having to battle the internal intergenerational trauma, but the actual still current threats of white supremacy and anti-indigeneity. So thank you for sharing that, Cheryl. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So we have a question from Elisa. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Elisa says, amazing work all. Thank you so much. And she asks, have panelists and their organizations worked with non-Indigenous land trusts on land rematriation or other projects? She would love to hear more and is interested in hearing about the barriers and opportunities of working with non-Indigenous land trusts. Are there ways non-Indigenous land trusts can be effective supporters of land rematriation? That was going to be my lead follow-up question to that too. If not, why? What are those barriers?
I can answer that because we're currently actively working with Open Space Institute, and this is not land rematriation, but it's leading into this. So I began working as a member of a tribal working group to develop the first state park in South Carolina, the Black River State Park Trail. And it has organically grown into being more than just being invited to consult on it, but actually opening up dedicated land within that state park system that will have a cultural easement and will be specifically laid out for intertribal use. And that's just because of the area. It encompasses about a 70-mile river range. And so as some of it is, landowners willing to sell their land, put it into conservation for this purpose. The relationships have also developed with the state parks. And so that's opened the door. I think when the overall goal is to protect lands and have access, protect the habitat and develop opportunities for other people to also have a relationship with land. I think that it's not difficult to align. I know there's been some issues with how conservation organizations have operated in the past, and my hope is that we'll be able to again share our truths so that it will change that it'll change some of that direction. They'll become our advocates and in helping us to achieve that. So I'm seeing this as it goes forward with the potential to develop funding specifically for tribes for land rematriation through the South Carolina Conservation Bank. I certainly can't do this on my own. So it does take partnering with the people that work in this space and have the same overall goals of, what do we need to do in the face of climate change? How can we ensure that there's equitable access to open space and that land is protected not just for humans, but for wildlife? I mean, they all align with our values. And as long as those are aligned, then it's a mutual agreement to work together. And I think that that's necessary. I'll stop there, but that's in the works. This is one of the things I found in the process of doing any of this is that the foundation has to be build your network, collaborate, have good capacity, build on your capacity, and that sometimes needs to be done through the partnerships and the collaborations with universities and with other conservation organizations, because we can't do this alone.
Thank you, Cheryl. Crystal or Talia?
Can you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
You're on mute.
Talia. So the question is, how can you or your organizations, or have you worked with non-Indigenous land trusts previously? And how can non-Indigenous land trusts be effective supporters of land rematriation?
I can speak to that by saying when we haven't worked with any non-Indigenous land trusts, we do have a Native Land Conservancy, which is, a land trust that's native within our town that is, was started by one of our, esteemed elders, Ramona Peters. So we do, within this process, I've looked to her personally for guidance and looked to the board, and I'm actually trying to meet with them soon because there's some complications with two of the parcels that are in front with, because it was purchased by a land bank. With restrictions on that and like how it could be disposed of and who it could be disposed to. So really, I think that's where land trusts can benefit, or Indigenous people can benefit with land trusts, is within partnering as far as if there is situations like that within restrictions of turning over land. I've recognized that there is some benefit within access as well, within creating those partnerships with land trusts and making sure that they kind of identify that, the Native people have access, and creating those like kind of projects and so on and so forth that might help rematriate that. But I will actually say within my own personal experience, because with enduring on this is relatively, new for me as far as this actual process of land back. Because, I'm a community organizer and culture keeper and a youth worker. So that kind of fell on my plate of a necessity to try and get this done and get what we need to accomplish. I participated in the Land Trust Alliance conference that they held out in Oregon, I believe, this past year. And I mean, there was a lot of fruitful conversations and a lot of, workshops that I benefited from by just learning kind of the world. But we did have a night where they had all the Massachusetts land trusts in one, like we kind of had a meet and greet. And it was very uncomfortable, to say the least, as an Indigenous person, because it felt like they were a little intimidated, one, because it's like, oh, this is kind of relatively new. Like we have one Native Land Conservancy, they know of them, and, they're kind of just gearing up and they're getting a lot more funding and a lot more land. And it's very kind of rapid as what they see. It's not for us because we know how long they've been organized for. But I think, with us coming in as a tribe, I was representing the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe, not necessarily an organization. It was a little like, are you our competition? Or, and obviously, Massachusetts is unique within its own way, as, the different states will be unique in their own way. But you can tell it's common for, I think within the Massachusetts government and just like organizations, they are very easily like ready to help out, nations that are, across the way. Like they'll go, across the country to help Indigenous communities, or they'll go outside the country to help different things like that. But when it comes to their own backyard or their neighbors, they're very hesitant, and it's a sense of fear, and you can really feel that when you're put into these situations like within the land trusts. So that's what I can say from my experience so far. I'm hoping that there'll be a lot more like fruitful conversations that happen within Massachusetts. But I have noticed, at least within the West Coast, that it seems like access and partnerships and things like that have been the route to kind of start these conversations and get that comfortability going. So I'm hoping we can, look to that and try and be more progressive within that way, because it was very, uncomfortable, to say the least.
Yeah, and before I'm gonna jump in, Crystal, really quick. Thank you so much for sharing that, Talia. And a huge part of so what Indigenous East likes to do is to try to collaborate with organizations on behalf, or of our network. And so I and a couple other folks, I'm really excited to announce that we're working actually with the Land Trust Alliance to this year is going to be in Rhode Island. And so some of the non-Indigenous land trusts have reached out and said, hey, we'd like to work with Indigenous tribes and land trusts. Where do we start? And so we're really building up that cultural competency first. And I've definitely noticed, I think that's a key to the brainwashing of colonialism, is that, we can go and help folks and then kind of be removed from things versus being a part of things. So thank you so much for sharing that. But I will definitely we'll definitely keep everybody posted on, the training as it goes. And we're hoping to see, that this year it'll, baby steps, so, Crystal?
Just briefly, so I also went out west to Portland and, during the Indigenous one portion of it, and got introduced to a couple of land uh, conservancies and land trust groups. And I will say that I've had conversations with, just yesterday, one of my team members met with Ramona to talk about the land trust, because we're interested in forming our own land trust, me and another associate. But what I've noticed is here in North Carolina, when I've reached out to land conservancy projects or nonprofit organizations, they seem very controlling of those and not wanting us to do what we want to do on our land, such as like our cultural practices. And they have some problems or issues around it. And so it kind of has left me a bad taste in my mouth about land trust, because I'm just like, oh, I'm so nervous about it. And also when I was at the University of Arizona in January, I took a class about environmental law, and I've worked with a non-Indigenous professor who works with tribes in Minnesota talking about land trust, and it kind of has eased my mind. But I just want to make sure whatever we do now can be beneficial for our next generations down the line, that we don't do anything that constricts their ability to do anything with that land. And so I'm kind of nervous about it, but also working with nonprofits and just also educating non-Indigenous land trusts about land use, the rights of nature, how we relate in a circular fashion versus a linear hierarchical standard, because most Western colonized thinkers think linear, and they don't think in a circular fashion. And so it's very hard, and we're just always in this learning process. And so I'm always seeking out new ways to educate myself better, to bring back to our community so we can try to help make these right choices. But the one thing I don't want to do is limit what my future descendants or children or grandchildren or great grandchildren can have a say in the land. So it's a work in progress. That's what I can say. Thanks, Dominique.
Thanks, Crystal. And I'm going to add one little thing. I think a big part is, and I feel like everyone kind of touched on this, is that we need to, or non-Indigenous land trusts need to start learning to trust Indigenous people, that we are not, to not view us in a paternalistic way, but to see us as independent sovereign nations. So we're getting to the end of our time here together. So I kind of combined the last two questions that I'm going to put here in the chat. And the question is, can you share a key insight, takeaway lesson from your experiences that you think would be valuable to help communities and organizations engage in similar work? Maybe some folks here on the call, maybe those watching later. And then also, could you kind of wrap that up with how can allies and supporters help with this work? And I just wanted to add to, in our follow-up email, we'll also include some resources for how folks can get in touch with y'all's organizations and support. So would anyone like to kick us off? Awesome.
So I just want to say that it's always important to develop this relationship with Indigenous nonprofits or tribal communities or tribal administration governments in relation to stolen land. So build these relationships back. And I know there's like a lot of land projects going on, but also if you see that, sometimes I will say tribal governments can be corrupted by money, work with the tribal leaders in the community, because they often represent the people. So like look for community organizers in those Indigenous spaces, and to get the temperature of what's happening in the community, because you can get just a one-sided story. So you're going to have to be an investigator and investigate all sides of the story, especially when it comes to land development in your community. I always say free, prior, informed consent And consent does not mean, or consultation doesn't mean consent. And those are the words that we're going to have to start pushing forward. It's used in an international space, but we're going to have to start being comfortable with these words here. And what was the last thing you said?
How can folks support?
Oh, how can folks support?
You?
Just
Mhm.
look at the projects in your community. And if you don't have any or you don't know anything, a Google search will be good. Look and see what community organizers who are Indigenous, what the work they're doing to see what projects are being affected. Talia really inspired me to come home when I met her, to come home and get our youth inspired in rights of the red wolf and rights of the sturgeon. And so we've been building a coalition around that because they had the rights of the herring, which is a tie back to their people, which is so important here because most of our people are, trying to learn their culture. But when you don't have the water or the land that's being healed, you can't heal yourself as a people. And so we have to understand that these fish or these lands or these waters are part of us. They're part of our story. They're part of our community, and we really have to give that respect back to nature on that. So that's my piece. So thank you so much for letting me be here and speak. I like
Thank you, Crystal. Cheryl? Awesome.
So yeah, completely can reverberate what Crystal said. And when I think about it's almost where I'm at, Horry County being one of the where our tribal lands are, being one of the fastest growing counties in the US. Development is always just it's just a threat. Um, and that part, I think, where I say, what can an organization do? How can we get the support that we need? There's still legal constructs. There's still things that have been established, and that's why it's so important to understand the history and how did we get here? That these things are in place and they are the roadblocks. We have almost a 300-acre tract of land called the Demery Tract, which was part of our settlement, original settlement, that ended up being in the hands of a family that became very politically powerful. They own thousands of acres within our original ancestral lands. And the means by which they acquired that, not necessarily good, based on oral stories, based on just investigation, that have led to some pretty nefarious actions during periods of time, starting a little over 100 years ago, including my own great-grandfather's tract of land. So this particular Demery tract is up against it abuts a tract of land that is owned by one of our tribal members who's a farmer. He recently, as of this week, he had to lease part of the original land back from this family to do his farm work, and they broke his lease. Because the land is earmarked for development, 450 little cookie cutter homes to be put on this land that used to be forested, um, you know, in somewhat a conservation state, because I've investigated and found that they received a lot of conservation credits over time for, ag land producing, and the trees are coming down rapidly, and the plans and everything is in the works. And I've like, what can we do to stop this? We found archaeological finds, which of course he can't really disclose that he's been trespassing on this land to find this, but like there's serious connection to our people, and it's really the frustration of I'm a problem solver. There's got to be a way to figure out how to solve this problem. This is not going to be the first time that this happens, because we see it all over. And the bad part is that there's not a mechanism to say what you're doing is not just bad for us culturally, historically, removing and erasing and paving over what was significantly connected to our tribe, but it's also the impacts to the environment as they dredge and fill wetlands that are now not jurisdictionally protected. Thank you, Sackett decision. So all of this is like coming to this head, and it's really, it inspired me to do something I can't talk about until April 16th, but it will be released to say we have to protect the waters, we have to protect those wetlands that at one point were connected, and protect this land, because the land is really crying out, I believe, and saying, you know, now is the time to start doing something. We're not going to be able to prevent, I think, what nature is going to have to do in order to survive. And nature will win. And I will just say it, nature will win. So
Cheryl,
I'm going to end on that.
be safe. Thank you for those powerful words, Cheryl. Talia, any last?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to keep you guys too long so quickly. I mean, you know, what Crystal and Cheryl were saying, we're all, you know, everything encompasses everything, really. But one big thing, like what Crystal was saying with the investigator piece, is that's what I've realized that helps me kind of have, you know, that not upper hand, but that confidence and that reassurance. One, if you're an Indigenous person, you know, advocating for these rights on non-Indigenous spaces is really, you know, knowing your history and knowing their law better than they know their law. Because that's one thing, you know, that you know, some non-natives get very frustrated with is, you know, when you know more than them, and you need to know more than them to even be at a level of speaking with them in some of their context of their frame of their brain. So knowing your history and knowing as much about the law and how it's transpired up until that point, because a lot of the time we learn from our, you know, past 7 generations, and we live for our future 7 generations. And that's one thing that the Western value system doesn't bring over with them when they're making these decisions and doing these things to the environment. So really, like, looking to that and remembering that and keeping that as your strength, and, you know, using your ancestors' strength to keep on pushing forward and being persistent, because the moment you stop talking about it, the moment they will let it slide under the rug. So you really have to be, you know, persistent and vocalizing, like using your voice, like using social media, using community outreach to really get your mission out there and focus on that mission. Because the American psyche does still have that fear. So if you focus on the mission and kind of reassure, you know, who we are as Indigenous people, it will kind of get to that point, because we know within our creation stories that it's about that time that non-Indigenous people are ready to listen to us. So just kind of keeping that in your forefront and really making sure that you're connected, staying connected with your community and their values, and deep rooted within that ceremony or within your tradition, so you can stay strong, because these are very uncomfortable conversations, and they're very uncomfortable just atmospheres and environments to be in as Indigenous people. And then as non-Indigenous people and within allies of fighting that, you'll see the reluctance and see when you see people that do have that, you know, fear within that American psyche. So you can kind of feel that, and using your voice and your face to really do it as a place of, you know, being able to connect with the community and in the entire community, and using that, you know, using their trust into you to really get that mission across and to advocate and really look to the Indigenous people that are in your area for that traditional ecological knowledge, knowing that, you know, not all Indigenous people are going to have the same knowledge, but if you're connected to that community, you will find the right person. And making sure that you keep that connection very fluid and healthy and just communicative, and really involving the communities together. Like what I see with non-Indigenous organizations around here, that they try to help within, like, kind of offering, you know, our students scholarships or apprenticeships or fellowships within that, you know, natural world, or, you know, for the clean environment, and making it specifically for Indigenous students, so we can expose, you know, our Indigenous youth on how ways that they can really be interacting within this world, using their traditional values and what we would traditionally do into, you know, modern day society, and how it can be helping combat this climate crisis. So bringing us together to, you know, really grow together and making the opportunities available, because that's, you know, that also comes with equality, because our kids don't have the same opportunities as the non-natives when they offer fellowships that, like, we have 2 weeks at sea, that, you know, our kids aren't going to be able to spend $5,000 to learn the marine biology and go out to sea with all these other kids. But if we have, you know, 2 spots or scholarships for those Native students and it exposes them, then they're right there with their peers and are able to compete in that way. So really just being open to that and being communicative within the Indigenous communities around is really important, because you don't know what you don't know. And you might think you know what's best for a community, but until you're in it and talking to them, you won't at that time. So that's what I can say from my experience is know more than them. And then, you know, kind of as an ally, making sure that you're having that communication and those opportunities for Indigenous folks, and especially Indigenous youth.
Thank you so much, Talia. Just appreciate everyone's words. I know we're a little bit over. I have a few wrap-up things of information before we say see you later. A couple of things are going to be following up with an email with both a link to this recording, so that if you joined late or you just want to review it, you'll have that available to you, as well as how you can specifically support Talia, Crystal, and Cheryl's initiatives. And then in the coming weeks, we're actually going to have a couple of updates to our website I mentioned earlier, but one is mapping. So really, how can we connect all of our rematriation projects together? And I also included a survey in the chat. So those who are involved with land rematriation, Indigenous land rematriation projects, or know who those who are, please feel free to share that survey. There's actually going to be a little giveaway, you know, for all those who participate. And what I'll also share too is, I know there was questions about how do we connect with other, or how do we connect with Indigenous land rematriation projects, whether you're an Indigenous land rematriation project yourself, or whether you are, you know, a non-Indigenous ally. We're actually working on a Google Doc, an Excel sheet that we're going to be promoting and broadcasting on our website, that shows all of the current land rematriation projects that we know of. So we're definitely going to need y'all's help, and we'll probably right underneath that put a little Google form of like, if you know anyone else, please feel free, because it'll definitely not be an exhaustive list by any means. We'll need y'all's help to make sure everybody's included. It'll be a community project that goes over time. And yeah, with that being said, you know, on behalf of both Alexa and I with Indigenous East, it's been such a pleasure spending time with you all and creating this safe space. We'd like to say in our Sasahi, our Yasa language, Kihoi hook nahampleke, bise hook, waok naho, waoki, maki, donesi. I'm still learning y'all. Bileoka, maki, lok, koyin, mabita hook. So biwa, bise hook. Thank you all for joining. Alewa. In our work and gathering here, we're good. So may all be well, and until next time, we say.
Thank
It's episode.
you.